Good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Wood, and I will be talking to you about Woodrow Wilson and his diplomacy um, during his two terms in office, and especially with regards to World War One. I've titled my paper "A Failure in Diplomacy: The Woodrow Wilson Administration and the First World War." Just go through my abstract. President Woodrow Wilson is arguably one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, if not all of American history. His mismanagement of America's entry into and participation in and following World War I exacerbated the Civil War in Russia, sullied the peace accords in France, and ultimately laid the groundwork for World War II. The steps he took to support the White Army in Russia transformed America's foreign policy agenda from a strictly isolationist approach, he kept us out of the war, to one more interventionist minded. This same approach to foreign policy was seen throughout the 20th century with American intervention and regime change in no less than 26 instances globally. Wilson established the standard for interventionism in America's foreign policy, and that would go on throughout the rest of the 20th century and even into today. It is apparent, given the outcome of the war and the peace treaty that followed, neither Wilson nor House, who was his right-hand man, Colonel House, had much impact on negotiating the peace in Europe they claimed to desire. Once war was over and the peace was being negotiated, Wilson's touted 14-point plan was largely ignored by his European allies. Throughout the Wilson administration, European dignitaries spoke critically of the Americans, as can be found in the letters and diary entries of foreign leaders such as German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, French Foreign Minister Philippe Berthelot, and British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey. This dismissive view of the Americans by the Europeans cost Wilson his idealistic goals in settling the war peacefully, and the stress brought on as a result may have ultimately cost him his life. Okay, the reason it ultimately cost him his life is the stress of the presidency led to him having. He had a stroke shortly after his return from the peace accords in Paris, and he was left incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency, and he died only a few years after he was out of office. But what we really want to focus on with this is we really want to focus on what happened during his last term in office. His last term in office, first of all, he got elected on the platform that he kept America out of the war. And it wasn't very long after his re-election that he started meddling in the war, and more so at a diplomatic level, just trying to. It doesn't want to get America involved in the conflict itself, sending troops over and all of that stuff. But he sent over his right-hand man, Colonel Edward House, to Europe to try to settle things, try to smooth things over. And Colonel House, when he first arrived in Europe, was way out of his league. He was used to Texas politics and handling things in the United States, which is totally different from the European sphere. When he gets over there, he's schooled really by the likes of Sir Edward Grey. He's the Foreign Secretary for Great Britain. And then later on, when we get into peace talks, we see the same thing with Clemenceau, who was the Prime Minister of France, David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and they were able to really play to House's vanity, and also the same with Wilson as well, through House and through Lansing and the other U.S. dignitaries who were over in Europe. And eventually Wilson comes over to Europe. He becomes the first sitting president to do so, the first sitting president to visit Europe during the presidency. And he's there for just a short time, trying to get his 14 points passed through, which ultimately are rejected, much as was Wilson's original peace plan, a peace without victory, which was what he was trying to get it pushed across at the onset of the war. That was rejected by Germany, by France, by Great Britain, because they all wanted to win the war. They all wanted to win. They didn't want to just give up on something that they invested so much into to that point. By the time the peace talks come around, Clemenceau in France, David Lloyd George in Great Britain, they want Germany to pay, and Wilson's 14 points didn't represent that desire. They felt it didn't have Germany paying enough, and so that's ultimately why it failed. Wilson is going to blame it on House, because Wilson leaves for a month, comes back, and House has conceded the 14 points. That destroyed their relationship completely. They never were this. They never really spoke to each other after that, and this stuff laid the groundwork for the bitterness and resentment in Germany and the rise of Hitler, which led to World War II. And it's all because Wilson and House they weren't well versed on diplomacy on the world stage. Thank you.